Delighted to. I'm delighted to open this afternoon's Centering Africa annual lecture, an event that has become one of the cornerstones of our intellectual and public programming here at the Centre. When I stepped into this role 5 years ago, one of the goals was to create a signature annual moment, a lecture that brings us together to engage with the work of prominent public intellectuals who in very different ways place the African continent at the centre of their thinking, their creative work, and their public engagement. So over the last few years, we've been fortunate to host an extraordinary group of individuals. In 2021, we welcomed Ella Wakatama, a leading voice in global publishing and African literature, who challenged us to rethink the infrastructures that shape how stories circulate and which stories circulate. In 2022, Timnit Gebru brought her groundbreaking work on ethical AI, urging us to confront the global implications of technological systems that more often than not marginalize African perspectives. In 2023, Monica Gandhi offered us a compelling lens on global health, connecting Africa's experiences to broader questions of equity and public policy. 2024 featured Kumi Naidoo, who with his long history of activism, reminded us of the deep interconnections between environmental justice, human rights, and struggles across the African continent and beyond. Most recently, in 2025, we welcomed acclaimed novelist and playwright Tsitsi Dangarembga, who spoke about her long career foregrounding the interior lives and political struggles of women in colonial Zimbabwe. Each of these speakers has helped us think more expansively about what it means to centre Africa, not as a geographic afterthought, but as a vital site of knowledge production, creativity, and growth. And this afternoon, we continue that tradition with what promises to be another truly exceptional lecture. I won't say too much about our speaker just yet, because we are fortunate to have my colleague, Professor Joshua Cohen, introduce her in full. Professor Cohen is Associate Professor of Art and Art History here at Stanford, and by courtesy of African and African American Studies. He is a historian of modern art whose work focuses on post-colonial African diaspora contexts, as well as the global Cold War. His research traces the movement of ideas, objects, and artists across Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States, and his much praised 2020 book, The Black Art Renaissance, African Sculpture Modernism Across Continents, offers a powerful rethinking of African sculpture's place within global modernism. Professor Cohen's work exemplifies the spirit of this series, a commitment to understanding Africa not in isolation, but as central to global intellectual and artistic histories. Before I hand things over to Joshua, I want to extend my sincere thanks to the people who made events like this possible. First, to my colleagues at the Centre for African Studies, Dr. Robin Chapdelaine, our Associate Director, and Bolo Oaea, our Program Coordinator, whose hard work and attention to detail bring these gatherings to life. So please join me in thanking them. I also want to express our gratitude to the Cantor Arts Centre at Stanford for their generous partnership, and especially to Christina Linden, the Director of Academic and Public Programs at the Cantor. It's really a privilege to collaborate with colleagues across campus who share our commitment to fostering meaningful interdisciplinary conversations. After the lecture, I warmly invite you to join us just next door at the Centre for African Studies, Encino 127. We'll have a celebratory drink and an opportunity to view our brand new photography exhibition, The Spiritual Highway. The exhibition features photographs by Dr. Akintunde Kinleye. It is curated by Nalos Jansen, Professor of Anthropology at SOAS, University of London. As you'll see, the photos explore religious world-making in the megacity of Lagos, offering a vivid look at spirituality, urban life, and visual culture in contemporary Africa. And finally, thank you all, students, faculty, staff, and the broader community for being here. Your presence is what gives this series its energy and its purpose. With that, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Cohen to the podium.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you to the Center for African Studies for bringing Natasha Becker to us. It's my great pleasure to introduce you Natasha Becker. She's the inaugural Curator of African Art at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Born and raised in Cape Town, South Africa, and trained in African history, photo history, and art history at the University of the Western Cape and Binghamton University. Becker has held curatorial and leadership roles at the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts, the Ford Foundation Center for Social Justice, and the Assembly Room, both in New York City, and underlying projects in Johannesburg, in addition to her current position at the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco. Since her appointment in 2020, Becker has spearheaded a bold reimagining of the De Young Museum's African galleries, moving away from traditional museum frameworks and toward transhistorical and collaborative curatorial approach that bridges historical African art and contemporary practices. As a curator and scholar, her work is defined by a commitment to redefine the experience of African art within global museum contexts. Her tenure in San Francisco has been marked by high-impact exhibitions that invite audiences into deeper dialogue with Africa's diverse artistic traditions. Her notable projects include Lhola Amira, Facing the Future, 2022, Leilah Babirye, We Have a History, from 2024, and the upcoming exhibition Nengi Omuku, The Gathering, which will open this June 27th at the Dion. Becker has also been a pivotal figure in institutional stewardship at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. She led the sensitive deaccessioning and restitution process for Benin bronzes and has secured major acquisitions from living artists such as Yinka Shonbare, Elias Sime, Esther Mwangu, Sana Gateja, and others. Before coming to San Francisco, Becker co-founded curatorial platforms designed to empower independent voices. She has curated groundbreaking exhibitions of contemporary art in particular, and has co-organized and implemented multi-year research projects and academic programs focusing on the history of contemporary African art, as well as East and Central European art history and Southeast Asian art histories. Becker is a prolific writer and public speaker, and she is currently co-editing a major publication on the Richard Scheller collection, and I'm honored to participate in that project. The title of her lecture this evening is The Arts of Africa, a Living Archive. Please join me in welcoming Natasha.
Just spin the mic check. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here, and I would like to begin by thanking about collaboration and partnership over the years. This patient to speak and it's good to be here and to share some of the ongoing research projects that I've been working on since I started my tenure at the Fine Arts Museums. So I'm going to jump right in and say that, when I arrived at the museum in late 2021, one of my first priorities was to undertake a deep dive on the collection. And, provenance research is an important part of that. Something that's often imagined as a technical exercise, a matter of dates, of transfers, and of ownership records. But what I want to suggest today is that provenance is far more than that. It's also a method, a complex act of decay, and increasingly a site of ethical transformation in museums. To explore this, I'll present 3 different research projects about the Benny dancers, photographs in collection, and animal masquerade. Each of these objects reveal a different facet of foregrounds. First, as a catalyst for institutional accountability. Second, as a window into global entanglements. And third, as a reminder that collections of African art are a living heritage. And across all 3, you'll notice something else, that these objects are placed in dialogue with contemporary African artists. Inka Shanibari with the dancers, Lhola Amira with photographs, and Negi Umuku with exhibition. These pairings reflect my curatorial approach, which is to treat the collection as not only a record of past movements, but also as a catalyst for present-day engagements. And by inviting contemporary artists into this conversation, we activate these objects and the museum as sites where history continues to be interpreted, challenged, and rethought. African art collections in museums are often treated as colonial archives and records of what was taken, when it was taken, and no more. But today I want us to think more expansively about how these collections live, how they move, unsettle, demand care, and continue to shape the present. This is what I mean by titling the talk a living art. So we'll move through these 3 projects not as isolated examples, but as points within a larger ecology of care and engagement, one that stretches, as I said, from institutional responsibility to global politics to the ongoing life of objects in the African diaspora. So let's jump in. We begin with a history that sits at the center of global museum discourse, bringing bronzes. The issues, as many of you know, center on the violent looting by British forces in 1897 and the ongoing struggle to return them to Nigeria. Western museums have long resisted repatriation, citing preservation or legal ownership or the idea of universal heritage, while scholars and activists have argued that colonial theft invalidates these claims. Recent restitution efforts, such as Germany's large-scale returns and Cambridge's transfer of ownership, signaled huge shifts. Debates also extend to Nigeria as well, and the broader African diaspora, where questions of custodianship, of historical accountability, and the role of communities complicate what restitution should look like. When I encountered the Benin bronzes at Museum in late 2021, the institution was already in the midst of dealing with restitution and repatriation debates. My first task was not simply to research the objects in the collection, but to understand what their presence meant today for the museum, for Nigeria, and for communities whose histories they embody. So the work began behind the scenes, reviewing accession files, tracing correspondences, rewriting object histories, and consulting with colleagues and scholars in the US and Nigeria. Much of this labor is invisible to the public, but it is foundational. Provenance research is not only constructing a chain of custody or ownership, but it's also was about preparing the leadership of the institution to act ethically. So these objects exemplify how provenance can become a direct catalyst for institutional responsibility and structural change. A few years later, our research culminated in the report on the deaccessioning of these 4 billion bronzes in the museum's collection. And this was approved by the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco's Board of Trustees on April 2nd, 2025. The decision involved 4 works, and of the 4, 3 were on display when I arrived. museum and removed from display in 2022. The graph on your left and the lip ornament table were all on display. The bronze block was purchased at a Sotheby's auction in 1980. The leopard leaf ornament was acquired in 1975 from Alexander Sutt's gallery, which is no longer in existence. And the wooden head of an ogre was gifted to the museum by Herbert and Natasha Becker in 1991. And the ceremonial wood table was also a gift of the trust in 2006. Deaccessioning these objects was thus not a single moment, but a combination of these years of internal assessments and presentations, conversations with leadership, presentations to acquisition committees, scholarly and community consultations, and a rethinking of how the museum narrates its own past over the last few years. It was also shaped by a major governance milestone. The February 2025 agreement between Nigeria's National Commission of Monuments, of Museums and Monuments and the current OVA of Benin, which clarified the authority and process for repatriation. And this agreement provides a clear path for any institution internationally towards this goal. So we are now entering this phase of communication to determine the next steps, to think about and discuss long-term stewardship models, to speak about co-steward, co-custodianship, and should these objects or others return to public view, will certainly be under this kind of co-stewardship of the museum, the OVA and the NCNM, and the narratives that they also shape the objects. Alongside this process, last year the museum acquired Monument to the Restitution of Mind and Soul, which was created in 2024. It's a work that remakes many stolen linen objects remade in clay. I think there's 100 or so small clay works that represent different kinds of rural Benin artworks. It was commissioned for the Nigerian Pavilion at the 60th International Art Biennale in Venice. And Yinda Shonibari offered this reflection on the intertwined histories of colonialism, cultural restitution, and artistic interventions. Rather than presenting a triumphant vision of history, Shonibari constructed this layered ziggurat populated with these detailed clay sculptures, miniature reinterpretations of rural Benin artworks. Each of these figures carry traces of lost resilience and creativity, engaging viewers in a dynamic ongoing conversation about the legacies of colonial violence and the possibilities of cultural repair. Monument mourns this loss, that also critiques it, but at the same time reimagines the conversation and the dialogue around repatriation. Through its fragile materiality, the work invites us to reconsider how we understand historical responsibility, and whether that ends when objects are repatriated, how we understand the role of museums, and the ways in which memory and effects continue to live and breathe within contemporary cultural spaces. And through the material choices we've made, the sculptural forms, and the strategic placement of the work within institutional museums, Shonibari continues to open up that space and keeps that space open for the Royal Kingdom of Benin's voice to be heard in a new way as an active participant in this global conversation. This monumental work is, asking these questions around what does restitution mean for mind, for soul, for the stories museums are. And through restitution through this work, I think the artist is really invested in a much more expansive idea of restitution that goes beyond return, but that is also about reimagining the very ways that we remember, that we share, and that we honor histories. And then the Richard Monument will be displayed at the Legion of Honor in the galleries, the European galleries, as well as the artist's upcoming solo exhibition at the museum. And so monument will place in the European artist section, but after the exhibition, it will come to the artist after the gallery, where it will be at the Young Museum, and so even within San Francisco and these two institutions, it will resonate between these two galleries. And I began the talk with Benin because it's a question I get asked most at talks, but also because provenance is speaks about more than what happened in the past. It's about what a museum chooses to do in the present and what it is willing to change. And having monument in the Arts of African Gallery keeps the conversation about social justice, museums, institutions. It keeps that conversation open. Whereas, there is a kind of closure that happens when objects are repatriated, that gives a sense of, well, we've done that now, so let's move on. Right? And I think it's going to be important to keep that conversation, that dialogue going into the future. So it's very important and exciting work for us to have questions. If the deaccessioning of the Benin bronzes foregrounded the institution's accountability and responsibility, the next project reveals something quite different. Global entanglements within which these objects and everyone who is involved in these histories are part of. And these objects show us how provenance can illuminate these complex cross-cultural networks and narratives that shape an object's life far beyond its geographic origin. When I began researching these figures, I accepted a familiar pattern, partial record of their departure from Gabon, the gaps in the archive, and then reappearances in European or American collections and museums. But what emerges instead is a story that moves sideways, across continents, across artistic circles, across the very boundaries we usually draw within artistic and institutions between African, European, and Asian art histories. The museum's reliquaries significantly the generous gifts of Richard Lhola, Stanford professor, and supporter of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco for decades. His gifts, four in this slide, represent some of the most distinguished examples of reliquary sculpture from Gabon. These were vital to African communities because they served as protective guardians for relics of ancestors. They embodied lineage, spiritual authority, and family continuity. In Europe and the United States, they became highly prized for their absolute quality, metalwork, and their influence on modernist aesthetics, European modernist aesthetics, leading to their prominence in major museum and private collections. Coated reliquary figures known as Bulu, Weti, or related terms were created by communities in eastern Gabon and the Western Republic of the Congo. Their metal plating, which was often made from expensive imported brass or copper, signified the importance of the deceased and the status of the family commissioning the figure. These sculptures were understood locally not as stand-alone artworks, but as the visible face of the guardian, with the true sacred power residing in the relics that they presided over. Typically, Europeans removed these sculpted heads from their reliquary bundles, which is why we see them out the bundles. They are some of the earliest and most iconic sub-Saharan artworks displayed in Western institutions, shaping global understandings of African art, while also raising many questions of context, cultural loss, the ethics of collecting sacred objects. Two of the most important works in the museum's collection have particularly rich histories, and it's here with Lhola comes a portal into these global entanglements. Let's do it. When it passed through the hands of Curator in a garden, suddenly his reliquaries part of African limited and honoring ancestors on. They are also part of the world of Parisian modernism, of studio practices, and of the material infrastructure that shaped how African art was displayed, understood, and circulated. Kachizo Inagaki was a Japanese master cabinet maker who became one of the most influential and least acknowledged figures in the Parisian art. Born in Japan, he arrived in Paris in 1906, and he initially struggled to find work, but eventually established a workshop where his meticulous woodworking skills caught the attention of the city's elite. He soon became the preferred mount maker for artists like Rodin and Uzi, Giacometti, and dealers like Paul William and Charles Dutton. And many of these artists had collections, their own private collections of ancient art. Rodin had a big Egyptian art collection, for instance, as well as African, but sometimes Oceanic, and also ancient Mediterranean art. As well as collectors like very well-known Helena Rubinstein. His signature contribution was the creation of a custom-carved wooden pedestal. This is like the footnote in art history, or in any historical studies. It's where some of the juicy things lie in footnotes, and this is a footnote in a much larger story, but it's an important one. So his signature contribution was the creation of custom carved wooden pedestals. Unlike generic factory-made stands of the time, his was tailored to the specific geometry of each object, often using high-quality wood like oak or mahogany, with subtle or dark patinas. They were very carefully carved, and they were designed to harmonize with what he described as the object's soul. Like an artist, he often signed his work with a small, discrete stamped signature, either in Latin characters or Japanese seal, on the underside or edge of the base. The presence, this is a quote, the presence of an Inagaki stand, said Charles Wesley Ward, allows us to place the artwork squarely into Paris' art market of the early 20th century, when African sculpture was being marketed as art moderne and absorbed into the language of modernism. Inagaki, some have argued, did more than just hold an object, did more than just create mounts to hold objects upright. They helped translate African objects into art for Western eyes by providing these formal, elegant presentations. He bridged the gap between the ethnographic and the modernist aesthetic that was all the rage in Parisian galleries. And I've added, just for interest and to give you a sense of how many objects his hands have touched, that this is from the Barnes collection. They have 98 objects that they have identified as having faces made by Inagaki. And you can see them on the website, and they're quite unusual, but this is only the Barnes Museum, the Barnes Foundation's collection. There are many more out there as well. So the other totem figure was owned by Lena Rubenstein, a beauty entrepreneur whose collection elevated African art to the status of high art. This is a 1940 photograph which shows her seated beside the figure, a reminder that African objects were not only circulating in the studios of Parisian artists, but also shaping the aesthetics of elite collectors. After her death, the figure was sold in a landmark auction in 1966 at Sotheby's, and this was considered the first major sale of African, Oceanic, and American art in the United States. From that auction, it entered a private American collection for more than 50 years before it came to the Fine Arts Museums in 2023. And so I want to emphasize that, for 50 years, from 1966, it was in a private collection. And now it's in a public collection more recently. So while there's much more to unpack in these trajectories, I just want to show, with this, in this particular case, that provenance is not a straight line from Africa to the West, and it is a much more complex web that in this case includes Gabonese communities, Maliquari practices, it includes the Parisian avant-garde, Japanese craftsmanship, European and American private collections, as well as contemporary museum practice. And each movement adds a layer of meaning. Each stop reshapes how the object is seen, valued, and understood. And provenance alone cannot tell that story, but interpretation does. And when we exhibited 9 extraordinary reliquaries from the museums and the Charlotte collection, we paired them with Lhola Amira's Constellations in the Arts Practical Gallery, a contemporary installation that engaged with ancestors and the ongoing presence of the past within the collection of the galleries and museum. And in that context, the reliquaries became participants in a conversation about art and healing, one that stretched from Devon to Paris to our museum today. Looking at provenance through these figures becomes about relationships and the way objects gather meaning as they move. And it's also about the curatorial choices that allow different meanings to surface. If the Ben bronzes showed that provenance can demand institutional accountability, the coaters show that the coaters also reveal that their entanglements, the dense, unexpected networks that shape the life of objects across time. And crucially, for me, they move across the boundaries that we usually draw between Africa, Europe, and Asia in both art history and museum collections. The Legion of Honor, as many of you may know, has an incredible collection of Rodin sculptures, so does the Cantor. And we never think about pairing Rodin with African art, for instance, right? So I think it's, these connections are just so dense, so layered, and so complex, and also so interesting. So my next project is this Ugandan masquerade. And it's a Paka Ugandan. There are different kinds of Ugandan masquerades, and this one is Paka Ugandan. It introduces a third dimension of provenance, the Rwanda, which moves from this history of ownership to an ethics of stewardship. And this dimension emphasizes a different kind of question, not where an object came from, but how a museum can responsibly care for an entity that may or may not possess spiritual and communal agency. When I first encountered the Ugandan in museum storage, where it had been sitting since 2005, it was displayed in the Vienna Museum opening in 2001, being in the museum as it is now. And then it was put back in storage, and I was in storage looking at objects, and I saw it sort of, to the right of me, and was very curious about it. And so the question in my mind was, care. How do we care for this object? And we quickly realized that standard textile conservation protocols were insufficient. The Igungan is not simply a garment. It is a Yoruba masquerade, in which this cloth, this layering, the whole masquerade, when activated by the dancer or the performer, becomes the physical manifestation of ancestral presence. And it's activated performance and community. The interplay of what is visible and what is invisible allows the ancestors' presence to be sensed as much as seen. And I inserted a little diagram of, an active. The term Igungan means powers concealed, and during the annual Igungan festival, which continues to up until today, performers will whirl about rapidly, causing the layered fabrics to flare outward in what is described as the breeze of blessings. The garment is constructed from hundreds of layers of cloth panels. I think this one has about 300. Often combining local woven indigo dyed cotton and imported damask, velvet, brocades, embroidered fabrics. These layers accumulate over time as families with patrons add new textiles to honor ancestors and display status. The garment includes a mesh or veiled face covering, often decorated with beads, cowries, coins, other symbols of wealth, spiritual potency. The materials are chosen according to Yoruba design principles, and may also incorporate charms or medicine to enhance the masquerader's spiritual force. Igungan ensembles are family heirlooms, heritage shrines, special storing areas associated with village. They are maintained by designated custodians who repair torn cloth, add new layers, and ensure the garment remains ritually potent. Because the fabrics symbolize both presence and social prestige, both ancestral presence and social prestige, their upkeep is a form of devotion and a public affirmation of the family's honor. So caring for this Igungan required a culturally sensitive approach, consulting Yoruba advisors, rethinking how we handled it, and developing a protocol that honored its potential agency rather than reducing it to material fibers. Beginning in 2022, we undertook a multi-year research and conservation project to understand the Igungan's history, materials, and spiritual status. The fact that Igungan in the collection is a 20th century Yoruba masquerade ensemble from Oyo State in Nigeria. It is characterized by this wooden horizontal bar that rests on the dancer's head, and hundreds of lappets, in this case made from cotton, synthetic fibers, velvets, asaobi, adiri, vinyl. It has mirrors, points, shell buttons that activate light and movement. It is in every sense a living archive of Yoruba histories, global trade, and ancestral connections. Our research uncovered several important clues. J.W. Jackal and Co. coins, which were minted in Nigeria between 1930, in West Africa between 1930 and 1950, appear throughout the garment. Republic of Nigeria commemorative cloth dates to the early 1960s in Nigeria's independence, and the layering suggests decades of renewal. That's a hallmark of an active Igungan masquerade, is that the ensemble is renewed with different methods over time. And these details place the garment's creation and evolution between 1930 and 1970, spanning colonial and post-colonial eras. This complexity reveals how truly layered this garment is. The ensemble sits at the intersection of pre-colonial Oyo and Oyo State. In other words, it embodies the geography that changed. It embodies the geography that changed around it. its ceremonial logic, its aesthetics, its social authority. All of these are parts of a long continuum. But the materials embedded within it, the commemorative cloth from the early Nigerian Republic, factory printed velvets, brought to Nigeria through colonial trade networks, coins minted by European textile firms operating in West Africa. All of these speak to a world transformed by colonial rule and its aftermath. The Ugandan is therefore not simply traditional, nor simply modern. Instead, it's a layered record as it moved from empire to colony to nation state. Its very construction holds the tension between continuity and rupture, the ancestral authority of the oil lineage system on the one hand, and the economic, political, and material realities of 20th century Nigeria on the other. So to care for this garment is to acknowledge that it carries all of these things simultaneously. In 2023, our team, a member of our team, Ayuari Balogan, Stanford student who was our first cataloguing fellow, traveled to Nigeria to consult with Yoruba scholars, including Professor Deli Laiwola at the University of Ibadan. Based on its size, based on the Ugandan Museum's collection, based on its size, its layering and materials, he emphasized that this Ugandan likely held high-ranking spiritual status. And because of this, we developed a new institutional protocol, one that recognized the Ugandan's potential agency. Every time the garment is handled, moved, or researched, a libation ceremony is performed by either myself, or whoever is the Curator of African Art, or if the Curator of African Art is not available, by the Curator of Costume and Textiles, or scheduled is available. Conservation treatments are conducted with cultural oversight. Although X-ray analysis revealed no hidden protective packets or amulets that might keep it spiritually active, at this time, the protocol remains. It is still part of the museum's stewardship practice. It represents a shift from conservation as a technical discipline to conservation as a relational one. Only after establishing this framework of care could we really begin to dig into the specifics of the provenance research. And even after 2 years, that remains inclusive. We know it was acquired from a commercial gallery by the museum in 1998 through a volunteer council fund. We know it originated in the oil region. We know that it's been identified as a specific type of fungus, part of the habitat. We know its dates, 1370, and that it was exhibited just once at the Diana in 2005 and has been in storage since 2022. Up to 2022. So we've not been able to trace it to a specific family or lineage. But these gaps are not failures, they are reminders of the archive, as well as of the knowledge that resides outside of the provenance in this space is an open horizon. I decided that we should exhibit the Ugandan in the next exhibition, namely in the gallery. And to do so in conversation with a contemporary Nigerian artist who paints on Sanyan, also a culturally significant textile within Yoruba culture. And her work engages with the ongoing presence of material history. All her paintings are on Sanyan. So unlike painting on a canvas, a blank canvas, her background already has a history that she is also conversing with in her paintings, which are about contemporary challenges that young people face in Nigeria. So bringing these two things together reframes the Ugandan as part of this living conversation and as part of this dialogue between past and present, between cloth as archive and cloth as contemporary expression. And we also extend that continuum to our visitors. The didactics invite them to contribute to the Ugandan's provenance, to share what they see, what they know, what they imagine. In doing so, we acknowledge that provenance grows through engagement, through dialogue, and through care. With the Ugandan, the collection is alive, and with many other objects too, of course. The collection breathes, it unsettles, and continues to show present, as I said at the beginning of the talk, and reminds us that museums do not merely hold objects, they hold relationships, and those relationships also require care. This is another pairing of a traditional Samian garment with Mingi Oku's self-portrait of herself, learning how to spin cotton. So across these research projects, we find that provenance is essential, especially for legal reasons, but it is never sufficient. Provenance tells us where objects have been, but not what they need. It reveals the past, but not the responsibilities of the present. And it cannot on its own account for the ways these objects continue to shape the worlds they enter today. In each case, these lessons are deepened by the presence of contemporary African voices whose work converses with the past. Their interventions remind us that provenance is archival, relational, and grows through artistic response, community engagement, and the museum's willingness to let objects live in the present. Together, these objects, these artists, our interpretation partners, and visitors remind us that historical African art collections are a living inheritance. They require us to listen, to learn, to repair, and to imagine. They ask us to see provenance as an ongoing practice, one that connects past and present, museum and community, scholarship and care. Provenance is certainly about restitution and the return of objects, yet it's also about activation, care, and future making in places where the objects currently live. A non-teleological provenance. And I believe that if we meet these objects with that kind of intention, with responsibility, with curiosity, with care, then the archive, the collection, the museum becomes a place and space for what can still be made possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That was a really riveting and inspiring account of your research at DIANG and beyond over the range of these three fascinating collections of objects. And I learned a great deal, so thank you.
Thank you.
We do have some time for questions, probably about half an hour or so. So this is a chance to open it up. We also have a group online, so we're going to try and also field questions from the audience online. So if you see me looking at my phone, I'm not kind of checking my social media, I'm checking questions. Yeah, let's start with an in-person question and then we'll take online. So Richard Roberts.
So thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. It's also very complicated. On the one hand, you're returning the King Francis, but you're not returning the Gabonese funeral reliquary. Can you explain a little bit what goes into preservation, retention, restitution, and what are the ethics involved? And I have another subsidiary question to that. And that is about 15 years ago, we at Stanford were offered a huge collection by a professional collector, Belgian collector, of rare material they collected in the Congo, without any sense of what the purpose was. He wanted to give it to us, and we had a really robust discussion here at Stanford regarding the ethics of this acquisition and what it meant. What was our role in holding on to this material? Not giving it back to the lead right away, with the fear that it would dissipate right away because of the lack of security within museums. If we didn't take it, it would then disappear in the private market. And so what was our role as potential trustees of this magnificent collection? for the people of the Congo in the future? And how would you?
Great questions. I mean, I think that, you know, those kinds of critiques of, you know, museums and what they return and what they don't return, I think those are all valid, you know, critiques of museums. I think also that we've seen cases where restitution is possible, like in the last 5 years. You know, there've been incredible restitution of Benin objects, and we've seen that that's been complex both internationally but also complex inside of Nigeria. You know, I was there when the new Museum of West African Art was meant to open, and there were huge protests by, you know, the Oba and local communities against the opening of the museum, because even though the museum is right there and the Oba's palace is right there and it's within Benin City on the same red soil, you know, that community consultation was still fraught and was still challenging. So I think that there's so many stakeholders involved and there are so many discussions that, you know, the work of repatriation is ongoing work. I mean, it doesn't, you know, going through the internal process, even, you know, handing over objects when you visit and going through that process, I think that it should continue after that. Like these relationships and partnerships should be created, and, you know, thinking about co-custodianship should also be on the table, because the scenario you sketched out was like one or the other, you know, but co-custodianship is the third object, is the third path, you know. And I'd like to see more co-custodianship discussions around co-custodianship, which isn't about, oh, you know, we'll have works on loan from, you know, the OBA after we've returned it, but that we'll actually think about, you know, and I think the museum in West Africa was trying to do some of this. They formed important partnerships with the British Museum. Their teams train conservators, you know, in West Africa. So there's a lot that's happening where everyone realizes that new kinds of ways of working together, you know, we have to find new ways of working together on repatriation. And so, yeah, where it's appropriate, I think it should definitely be there, and where we can develop collaborative models, that should be there too. And, you know, at the Fine Arts Museums, we have a page on the website that deals with repatriation. And it's not only of African art objects, you know, we have objects that have been repatriated in the past from oceanic collections, from Arts of the Americas. And it's something that, and of course, NAGRA and CalNAGRA is, you know, we have a dedicated person working on that form of repatriation. So it's just part of our work that we do actually now, which I think is different from 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And that we, you know, hopefully could have dedicated, you know, provenance researchers, dedicated repatriations, you know, staff. But that is becoming an area where a lot of curators in different institutions have had to, you know, learn those skills and begin doing that work. And, you know, there are many colleagues that, you know, are not represented here in my presentation, but we have many colleagues that we can go to at the Met, you know, even the Stanley Museum in Iowa repatriated, you know, a few things. And so there's a lot of expertise that has been developed in the United States and inside of institutions. And I think that's all positive. I think it's much better than, you know, the landscape was before.
Before we take a question, can you just clarify NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA? For those who might not be.
So that has to do with the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, and there's CalNAGPRA is a statewide. So for Africa, for instance, there's no CalNAGPRA or NAGPRA. There's no state or federal laws governing repatriation, right? The provenance is important to us for legal reasons because of international laws, but we have to work together to figure out what is, the best way for us to do the work that we do. And of course, there's lots of resources and, as I mentioned, expertise. But the United States does have laws that govern the repatriation of Native American objects in collections. And that work has been steadily being done by institutions across the United States. And that work is, institutions are compelled by law to repatriate. And so different tribes are able to make claims for objects that they would like to have returned, and that is happening across the United States. And tribes can also come and just, be with objects as well, right? Because repatriation, like I said before, I think we also need like this wider aperture, where we can look at beyond objects. How can we continue to think about care and, social justice and cultural collaborations beyond that, or as part of that, maybe is a better way to put it. And so that obviously in the United States, that situation is very positive for tribes because they have a legal mechanism, and there is a duty. And so that work is really robust in the United States right now. And that is also something that has only happened in the last few years. But it's been very important, and it's changed, it's shifted. It's been a big change within institutions.
Question from Maria Nagawa, and then we'll go to Cockbrook.
Thank you very much for this talk. I was wondering about custodianship at the country level, not like between the museum that's abroad and whoever is the entity in the country from which this work was taken. For example, once I visited the Gold Museum in Bogota, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. All this gold, I'm from Vietnam, they would have stolen all of it. And they were like, well, it's held by the National Bank of Bogota. And so I just thought that there are all these institutions, even within the state, that have different capacities to hold these artifacts. There are these different actors, maybe private sector actors, nonprofit, that have different capacities to hold these artifacts. Is there a role for local co-custodianship? Is there an appetite for local co-custodianship? Even if at that level, there is still some custodianship with the external party.
Yeah, I think there's interesting examples of that in Africa. When I was in Nigeria, for sure, there are collectors inside of Nigeria who collect historical Nigerian objects, and lots of them, and then there are national institutions also that have their collections, and a new university museum that was established by a private individual that is, incredible. So I think that, and then, Zambia, for instance, also there are interesting models of communities working with institutions in Europe in very focused, very small ways, where elders are looking at photographs or have laptops and, both adding to the knowledge and information and stories about objects, but also, being able to reconnect culturally. Because in Zambia, there's a really interesting case in Zambia where communities were moved when they built this big dam. They were moved away from their traditional sort of land. And so where they live now, this also gives them an opportunity to reconnect culturally and for their kids to reconnect. The kids are off at university, and it's just older people behind. But that is a very interesting project that is, kind of grown as a model of like local co-custodianship, and there are others. So I don't know how big that appetite is for that kind of work necessarily, but I do think that, we definitely, if we spend more time in Africa, a lot has happened in the last 25 years where there is infrastructure being built. There are people leading projects in Africa. I always like to joke that Africa does what Africa's going to do, they are not going to sort of wait for what I'm doing at the fine arts museums, So I think that it's always exciting when you're there to see that there are these, projects and that are happening. And it differs across the region, obviously.
Grant Parker.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just wondering what is at stake with the category of art, or what might classify as art in this particular context, and how much of the conversation today requires that kind of category. As I'm working on South Africa, I'm aware of very intense debates around human rights, for example. As someone who studies enslavement, I'm aware of the San Jose work, collaboration between the Smithsonian and Iziko, in which the finds come to the Smithsonian for a period. Perhaps they're going back to Cape Town eventually. I don't even know if the date is set. So in those cases, that's far from both of those are far from the charismatic objects that you've shared. Wonderful examples. So yes, it's a question about what is different about art, or what we might consider to be art.
That's a great question. I mean, I think that because many of the collections, as different institutions, their collections come together in different ways, but human remains is somehow always recorded as human remains. And that's what I find interesting, is that anthropologists, ethnographers, colonial, governors, like, we know what are human remains in our museums. That category seems to have been always identified. People always know what they are. And so I'm just thinking about your question, because actually there's never really any doubt that something is human remains. We have the technology to know that it's human remains. If we don't, we have records, we have all this information. And usually again, you kind of, when it comes to Africa, you build a case for, the institution to make an ethical decision about that. For instance, one of the projects that I'm also working on with regards to repatriation is a Cameroonian, which we think are, domains. And so I've written to, Cameroonian authorities, because we, as an institution, don't want to have human remains, both whether it's NACTO or CalNACTO, but also within the collections at large. And so that's like a kind of special area of work too that happens. And that's always very clear, like there's no ambiguity, And then when it comes to the category of art, that's also very clear, that it's an artwork, and precisely because it's already moved through this history, and as you can see, it's already been changed as it's moved around. Like, objects, the Ugandan, for instance, had been hosed down, by the gallerist who wanted it to be sort of bright and, appealing. And so the soil and the dirt that, would have gathered as it's doing the performance had been hosed down. So objects have changed in this, 100 or so year history, and the movements, and whether they've been stored or in a collection. And so in the process of changing them, and that's why I brought up the example of Inagaki and the Mount Maker, how somebody who seems so small and something that seems so insignificant to the history of objects actually fundamentally, radically changed the object and the presentation of the object. And through those strategies, objects do become art, in the Western category of art. And that doesn't mean that there weren't ideas of aesthetics and of, form and of the function of objects, that carvers who carved these objects weren't thinking about those things. It doesn't mean that at all, but I think that it was just a different context.
Adele, stop.
Thank you so much for this. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the ways that you choose the contemporary artists that go in the Africa Gallery, and if those artists have relationships to the collection, or if they're sort of helping you curate alongside the pieces that are already in that collection.
Sure, thank you. So far, the three artists that I've chosen, I've all known in some capacity, known their work. And in this program, I'm specifically choosing artists who are in some way, whether it's conceptually or formally or aesthetically or materially, drawing on African art history. So that's very important. And of course, they're mixing this up with other strategies too. Lhola Amira is drawing on the Nguni spirituality, on Christianity, you know, a complex of concepts and ideas, as well as aesthetic strategies, right? And so with Lhola Amira, for instance, I knew that I wanted to start with an artist who could kind of clear the air, so to speak, you know, within the museum and within the collection. The museum is over 125 years old, but you know, I'm the first dedicated full-time person for the collection, and so I felt like maybe there was just some stagnation over there that we needed to, you know. And of course, the collection had been maintained by the heads of our departments and by other colleagues who were, you know, consulting. But I felt like, you know, maybe we needed an artist like Lhola Amira to fill a whole space, and you know, who really truly still believes that we can connect with ancestors and that they can serve us in our lives today. And so, yeah, I chose it for that very particular reason, for this like new start. And you know, the title of the show, Facing the Future, was symbolic in that way. And with each artist, and the second artist, Leilah Babirye, I met about 8 years ago. I knew I at some point wanted to work with her because you know, she's from Uganda, she's a sculptor, but she's a woman, she's queer, and she's sculpting in using the same techniques that African carvers have always used. She's making ceramics using the same techniques that, you know, African ceramic artists or most women have always used, hand foiling. But she's creating forms that, you know, we haven't ever seen before. And so it was important to place her, you know, within this history of African sculpture and carving, and also adornment, and you know, and in each case, when I invite the artists, we start with a conversation. They come to the museum, they come on a visit, we walk through the galleries, we have many conversations, and we co-curate the show in the sense that we don't know what it's going to be, but at the end of the process, we know what it's going to be. We have the title, we start thinking about objects, we start moving things around. And so there are things in the gallery that are there, but there are also objects that move in the gallery. We can bring out new things, we can send things back into storage. For instance, I discovered recently when I was working with an interpretation fellow who was working on Ikenga figures, who said, they should really, we should really look at this more closely, rather than have it on display. It would be a Stein figure, and so we started working on that, and we can take that off view, and we can think about, the work that we want to continue doing on that, but do something else, out. And so the collection is in conversation with the artists, and so each one will be a little bit different. We've never shown textiles in the gallery before. We'll bring out two kente, textiles and the Ugandan, for instance. So it evolves with each artist, yeah.
Okay. Are you right if we take a couple of questions together, just to make sure everyone gets a chance? So let's hear from Naomi, Matthew A. Dylan, Joshua Cohen, or maybe take two and then we'll go to Joshua for the next one.
Thank you so much for being here. I was really struck by the discussion on the Ugandan masquerade objects. particularly the sort of talk about activation and how performance, movement, and the community was really vital to activating the object. And I was just wondering how you view accompanying text and labels when you're operating with objects like this, and sort of the role that they have in maybe doing the work of care that you speak about. Yeah, I was even just struck by the fact that you said that you saw it in storage. So just even that sort of process, being in the storage to being on display, and then the work of deciding or curating even the text that.
Oh, thank you so much for participating. It's nice to see you again. I mean, so recently, this discussion about establishing a central framework to advance the core operation. But I think one of the problems about this discussion is the problem of where exactly, where exactly is it the states or the indigenous authorities? In the case of Nigeria, is it the urban community or the Nigerian government? And so I just really want to hear more about your experience, shed light on what makes you museum. What do you like with some museums or what did you get on museum? What did they really prioritize? Repatriating these objects to indigenous authorities or to the states, to the government. So, right? And what are the implications of
Thank you. So to answer your question about the Uganda, yeah, I mean the didactics for this upcoming exhibition, for each exhibition we invite interpretation partners, and I work with the director of interpretation at the museum, and we look at what's the big idea for the exhibition, what are some of the themes, what are some of the objects, and what are some of the stories, the supported stories we want to tell that can connect the big idea. And here the big idea is around gathering, gathering of ancestors, gathering of objects, gathering of people, gathering for, personal community level, but also gathering for activism and protest, and sort of range of meanings, but also gathering could also be like a threatening too. And so then we kind of, go through those themes and ideas. And when it comes to the didactics, some of the interpretation partners offer to write labels and motets, and they work with me. We, look at what object they're interested in, what scholarship is on that object, and they start drafting and we go back and forth. And then I do some of the didactics as well. And there's some sort of standards and guidelines, like we want to have an introduction text, for instance, and then we have a guideline from the institution that, well, you'll use a focus text when you want to say something like this, and you'll use, you'll use an extended text when you want to say something in particular about that. So we have some guidelines for how we pass out all this, information. And with the Ugandan section, we have we will have several didactics actually, one which will sort of talk about this as a research project and will invite, comments. We'll have one that links to an article written by our fellow on the first round of conservation research that she did. So, you could go a little deeper into that. We'll have some extended labels. We have a quote by a scholar that she visited in Nigeria. So, trying to create different voices around the Ugandan so that it's not, one voice, and just trying to change those narratives and, just the voice and the tone in how we communicate about the Ugandan too. So, yeah, it's part of that process. Yeah, I don't. So for a long time there was a lot of ambiguity and confusion, I think, around what that process is. And, I know some institutions who have repatriated directly to the Oba, and I know some colleagues at institutions who have repatriated through the National Museum, the museums and monuments, National Authority. So it seems to me that the best practice is to go through the National, Monuments Council, because it is the national authority for Nigeria, and the politics can change so quickly that is what has, I think, led to many changes in this repatriation process, because Benin had a governor that was there was a previous governor, now there's a current governor. They both have different allegiances to the Oba as well as to the national authority. So it actually involves everybody, But I think we send out the initial communication and outreach to both. And for us, it's important that all the stakeholders are at the table and, come to the decision. And I think even the decisions that we make around the table, that could change in 10 years when, the political situation, the social situation can change again. But that's beyond our control, I think that a lot of this is really about having complicated conversations, And then there is, for institutions outside of Nigeria internationally, we also have to follow international law, And so when I write an email or a letter, or I talk to anybody, it goes through the city's attorney. I'm not speaking for myself as a curator. I'm speaking for the institution, and with the support of leadership, and an attorney for the city that is the attorney for the museum. So, there's all these stakeholders. I think it's very hard to choose who you're going to prioritize.
I think we have time for one final question.
One last one. I'll make it quick. Thank you for your presentation. I think you enlivened and animated the category of provenance research. Which that name alone doesn't exactly sparkle, but you made it sparkle. So thank you for that. My question is about I suppose a different temporal framework than from the ones that you've mentioned and that you are usually mentioned in African art curating art museums. One of those temporal frameworks being historical, the other being contemporary. So my question is about the modern. As we know, so much of the collecting in the art context in Europe and North America and other parts of the world emerged through this sort of relationship, historical relationship, but sometimes also fabulated in the minds of collectors between modernism, European, North American modernism, and African sculpture. We now know from the work of some curators in the field and scholars as well, including myself, admittedly, that there's this rich history of modernism and also other kinds of art kind of between what we call the historical and the contemporary temporally. So I'm just curious of what is the status of the modern for you? I know there's only so many things you can prioritize, and also that there's probably another department called modern and contemporary. So how do you negotiate? How do you think about the modern and kind of how do you, I suppose, negotiate with or work with your colleagues in modern and contemporary in relation to modern African art?
Okay, that's another talk. Yeah, I mean, I want to, expand and open the aperture of provenance a lot more, because I think it's become very narrow in the sense that, created in X culture, collected by Y, entered Z museum. And I think that, turns a very messy, violent history into a very tidy story of arrival at the museum. And when it comes to repatriation, then also to widen that aperture a bit so that it's not, we don't stop at return, as if the original community still exists where it existed, or that in the same form, in the same place, that, with the same continuity, and which completely erases the very histories that we want to, unearth. So just, like I said, open that up a little bit more to think, more deeply about both repatriation and provenance. In relation to the categories, curatorially, I operate with an idea of cosmic time, and in the shows and when you're in the gallery, I feel, and I hope visitors also feel, that the categories collapse a little bit, that maybe you're not thinking so much about, I'm hoping that we create an experience from objects and visitors that you are drawn more to, what you are in the midst of and what you're experiencing, like whether it's traditional, historical, modern, or contemporary art, But I will say that we could probably, and I would be fully supportive of renaming the entire, historical collection as modern art, because it falls within the modern period. But then we'd have to call modern African art something else, and so I think these categories, they exist to make things really neat, to make things that are not neat and orderly and well behaved, behave well and be orderly, and I have a huge, I think we're missing out on, all the richness that is there if we are only concerned with categories. So, it's not something that I give a lot of thought to, but I was walking through the collection with our chief curator once, and we were having this exact conversation, because we do have modern and contemporary, and then we do have oceanic art, and we have arts of the Americas and the arts of Africa. And I actually think the advantage of us being who we are is that we can be transhistorical. We actually have the freedom and flexibility to do that. And that is a much more interesting way of working, because, we can always collaborate. The contemporary department and the African department bought the industry body together, So we used our acquisition funds to jointly purchase that work. And there are other artists that we overlap with and that we are interested in, and that, we either want to bring out for the talk or acquire work or do an exhibition with in the future. So those moments exist there, but you're going up against 100 years history of institutional and canonical categorization. It's the whole European system from Linnaeus to now, and so I try not to worry about those things.
Seems like a very appropriate moment to end. Before we make it, everyone's invited after this to just go out the door, and 2 doors to your left is the Centre of African Study, and we have a small reception. So please do join us. Thank you so much, Natasha. Let's keep this.